Snow had not yet stopped falling over Ashcombe Hall when the new guard screamed. It was not a sound anyone expected from a grown man in a Fenwick livery coat, but there it was, cutting across the stable yard at 6:30 in the morning, followed by the crash of a lantern hitting frozen cobblestones and going dark. Wolf had him by the sleeve. Not the throat, never the throat, not even now, but the thick wool of his coat, worried between teeth the size of a man's fingers, dragging him backward through the snow, while the dog's low, continuous growl rolled through the yard like distant thunder. 2 footmen came running. A third called for old Tam. Nobody moved to pull the animal off, because everybody at Ashcombe Hall had learned, in the 2 years since the old Duke's death, that no one touched Wolf when his hackles were up, not even Crane, who arrived white-faced and shouting orders nobody obeyed. It was Effie Marsh who walked out of the kitchen door in her apron, hands still dusted with flour, and said quietly, "Wolf, enough now." The growling stopped. The dog let go of the guard's sleeve, turned, and pressed his great grey head against her skirts, as though nothing at all had happened. Every person in that yard went still, because in 2 years Wolf had never once let a man in Fenwick livery within arm's reach. And Effie Marsh was wearing an apron, not a coat, but she worked for the house all the same. Nobody could explain it, not yet. The kitchen at Ashcombe Hall began its day in darkness, the way it had every winter morning since Effie had come there 4 years ago, half-starved and asking for any work at all after her father's fishing boat went down off the Northumberland coast and took the family's living with it. She had learned to make herself useful quickly. Scullery work was the lowest rung in the household, but Effie had grown up doing her father's accounts by lamplight, tallying catches, wages, debts owed to the chandler, and she carried that same careful eye into everything she touched now, even scrubbing pots. She noticed things. It was, Mrs. Tilbury liked to say, both her gift and her curse. "You'll want to leave off staring at the coal ledger and get the porridge on," Mrs. Tilbury said that morning, not unkindly, setting a tray down, hard enough to rattle the spoons. The housekeeper had run Ashcombe's downstairs for 30 years and missed very little, including the fact that Effie had been frowning at the household accounts pinned by the larder door for a full minute. "The coal bill's wrong again," Effie said. "Same as last month. We're charged for 11 loads. I counted 9 delivered." "Then you'd best keep such counting to yourself," Mrs. Tilbury said, lower now, glancing toward the passage. "Mr. Crane does the ordering. Mr. Crane does the paying. It is not scullery work to question either." Effie said nothing more, but she did not forget. She saw the Duke only once that morning, from the kitchen window, crossing the yard in a dark greatcoat, with the quick, contained stride of a man who did not waste motion on anything. Not conversation, not warmth, not even grief, though the whole house still spoke in careful tones about how he'd taken his brother's death. He did not look toward the servants' door. He rarely did. Josiah Crane followed a pace behind him, coat immaculate, voice pitched low and persuasive, the way it always was when he had something to explain away. Effie watched them go, then looked back down at the ledger pinned to the wall, at the 2 loads of coal that existed only on paper, and felt the same small, stubborn itch she always felt when a number didn't add up. Wolf, chained near the kennels, lifted his head and watched Crane's retreating back the entire way across the yard, and did not stop watching until the steward was gone from sight. By the 2nd week of January, Effie had stopped pretending to herself that it was nothing. She had taken to staying a quarter-hour later each evening, after the kitchen was banked down and Mrs. Tilbury gone up, working through the ledgers pinned by the larder with a stub of pencil and the back of an old flour sack. Coal, candles, butcher's deliveries, grain for the stables. Small enough discrepancies that no single one would draw a magistrate's eye, but taken together, month over month, they came to a sum that made her sit back on the cold stone floor and press her knuckles to her mouth. Someone was skimming the household accounts. Not carelessly, carefully, the way a man skims who has done it a long while and grown confident in it. She did not need Mrs. Tilbury to tell her whose hand held the pen. Every order, every payment, every ledger passed through Josiah Crane before it ever reached the Duke's desk, if it reached the Duke's desk at all. It was Crane who found her 3 nights later, kneeling by the larder with the flour sack spread before her. "Miss Marsh," his voice was pleasant, which was worse than if it had been sharp. "Kitchen maids have no need of a lamp burning past 10. Candles cost money. You above anyone should understand that." "I was only tidying the shelves, sir." "With a pencil." He crouched, unhurried, and lifted the flour sack from her hands before she could stop him, his eyes moving down her tallied columns with a stillness that frightened her more than shouting would have. Then he smiled, folded the sack, and put it in his coat. "You've a talent for arithmetic, for a scullery girl. Curious, where a fisherman's daughter learns her sums. My father kept his own books, sir. I helped him." "Did you?" He straightened. "Well, I shouldn't like Mrs. Tilbury to think her staff idle with lamp oil, nor His Grace to hear that a maid's been meddling in accounts above her station. It would go badly for you. I'd hate to see a girl with nowhere else to go turned out in this weather." It was not a threat spoken aloud. It did not need to be. He left her kneeling on the cold floor, and it was Mrs. Tilbury who found her there minutes later, face bloodless, hands still shaking. "He took my sums," Effie whispered. "Then you'll not write them again where he can find them," Mrs. Tilbury said. But she sat down beside Effie on the stone floor, heedless of her own aching knees, and did not tell her she was wrong to have kept them in the first place. "You listen to me, girl. I've watched Josiah Crane 30 years. He does not frighten easily, and he does not threaten easily either. That he troubled himself to threaten you means you'd found something worth finding." She did not expect to speak with the Duke at all, and certainly not 2 days later, in the stable yard, over a dog. Wolf had slipped his chain, not difficult for him, when he chose, the kennel boy admitted miserably, and taken up a position squarely between Effie and the yard gate, refusing to let her pass toward the kitchen garden until she'd scratched behind his ears and told him, in the low voice she used for him alone, that he was a great foolish creature and would catch his death sulking in the snow. "He does that," said a voice behind her, "for no one else in this house." She turned too quickly, dropped a small, awkward curtsy, and found herself looking up at Duke Roland Fenwick for the first time from less than 10 feet away. He was younger than she'd expected, close to, younger than the weight he carried in his shoulders suggested, and his eyes, she thought, had the same watchful stillness as his dog's. "He was chained wrong again, Your Grace. I only quieted him. Old Tam trained that dog to distrust every man in Fenwick livery," the Duke said, watching Wolf lean his full weight against her skirts with evident contentment. 2 years, and he has never once let Crane within 10 feet of him, nor any guard we've hired since. I've had grown men refuse to walk the east wall after dark for fear of him." A pause. "You are not the first maid to work in this house. Why you?" "I couldn't say, Your Grace." It was true. She had never fed Wolf scraps deliberately, never sought his favour. He had simply, from her first winter at Ashcombe, chosen her. The Duke studied her a moment longer than was comfortable, not unkindly, but with the same careful, assessing stillness he seemed to bring to everything, as though he trusted nothing he had not turned over twice in his own hands. She thought of Crane's smile in the larder, and wondered, with a small cold jolt, whether the Duke's guardedness was armour of the same kind Wolf wore, and just as hard won. "Mrs. Tilbury tells me you've a head for figures," he said unexpectedly. Her stomach dropped. "Who told her that, Your Grace?" "No one needed to. She's run this house longer than I've owned it. She notices things." He glanced toward the kennels, where old Tam sat wrapped in a blanket despite the cold, coughing into a handkerchief, watching them with an expression Effie couldn't read. I begin to think, does my dog?" He said nothing further, only nodded once. To her, or to Wolf, she wasn't certain, and continued on, across the yard, leaving Effie standing in the snow, with her heart beating harder than the brief, ordinary conversation seemed to warrant. Old Tam died 3 weeks later, but not before he gave Wolf one last order. Effie had taken to bringing him broth in the evenings, after the old kennel master's lungs grew too weak to manage the walk to the kitchen himself. He was a spare, silent man who had served 3 Dukes of Ashcombe and buried 2 of them, and he watched her with the same unreadable patience the current Duke had, as though the whole household were a ledger he alone had the sums to. "You've been at the accounts again," he said one evening, not a question, his voice a papery rasp. Effie nearly dropped the broth. "How could you know that, Mr. Tam?" "Because Crane's been sniffing round the kennels asking after you. A man doesn't do that over nothing." He set down his cup with trembling hands. "I trained that dog myself, girl. Trained him hard, and I'll tell you why, since I'll not have breath to tell it much longer. The night the old Duke, the young Duke's brother, died, I saw a man in livery leaving the East Passage near midnight, when no man had cause to be there. I never saw his face, only his coat and his walk, Crane's walk. He coughed, long and wet. I said nothing. I was afraid and old, and I've regretted it every day since. But I kept what proof I could find. Hid it where Crane would never think to look, in the old feed store, behind the grain bins. And I taught that dog to hate every liveried man who came near it, so that if I died before I found the courage to speak, someone would need only follow him to find the truth. He died 2 nights later in his sleep, with Wolf lying across the foot of his cot, refusing to be moved. It was the morning after the funeral that Wolf came to the kitchen door, took the hem of Effie's apron gently in his teeth, not the aggressive worrying she'd seen with the guard, but something almost pleading, and pulled. She followed him across the yard, past the kennels, to the old feed store, a low stone building nobody had used in years, its door swollen shut with disuse. Wolf scratched at the base of it until she found the loose plank old Tam must have used, and crawled through into the dark, dusty interior, feeling along the grain bins with cold fingers, until she found, wrapped in oilcloth and pushed deep behind the timber, a second set of ledgers. Her hands shook as she opened them by the thin light from the doorway. Here were the true figures, the real coal deliveries, the real tenant rents actually paid, the real wages, set against the false numbers Crane had entered in the household books, the difference between them totaling, over 2 years, a sum that made her sit down hard on the cold earthen floor. And tucked into the back page, in old Tam's careful, laborious hand. The night the young master died, J.C. was seen leaving the East Passage at Crane, discovered the ledgers missing within 2 days. Effie did not know how, whether he'd finally worked up the nerve to search the feed store himself, or whether some instinct told him old Tam had died with a secret still unspoken. But she felt the change in him at once, in the tightness around his mouth, in the way his eyes tracked her now across every room she entered. She had hidden the true ledgers beneath a loose floorboard in the scullery, wrapped still in old Tam's oilcloth, and told no one but Mrs. Tilbury, who had gone very pale and very quiet, and said only, "Then we must go to his Grace, and soon, before Crane goes to him first with some tale of his own." But Crane was faster. He came to the kitchen on the 3rd morning with 2 footmen and a face arranged into careful, sorrowful concern, and announced, in a voice pitched to carry, that a sum of household silver had gone missing from the plate-room, and that Effie Marsh had been seen near it, unsupervised on more than one evening. "I've said nothing before now," Crane told Mrs. Tilbury, with the pained reluctance of a man performing regret, out of consideration for the girl. "But I cannot in conscience stay silent longer. His Grace's account books are not the only thing that requires an honest hand." It was, Effie understood at once, cleverer than an outright accusation of theft from the ledgers. It gave Crane grounds to have her dismissed, searched, discredited, before she could ever bring old Tam's evidence forward herself. Once a maid was branded a thief, who would believe anything she said against the steward? "That is a lie," Effie said, and her voice did not shake nearly as much as she expected it to. "I have never once been in the plate-room unsupervised, and you know it, Mr. Crane, because you have been watching where I go for a fortnight. A serious accusation from a girl accused of theft." "Then let the Duke decide who is lying," Mrs. Tilbury said, stepping bodily between them. For I'll not stand in my own kitchen and hear a girl condemned on your word alone, Josiah Crane, not after 30 years of watching you smile at people you mean to ruin." It was the first time, Effie thought, that anyone in the household had said such a thing to Crane's face, and something in his composure cracked, just slightly, just long enough for her to see the calculation underneath it. "Have her searched," Crane said to the footmen, and there was no pleasantness left in his voice at all. "And have the dog chained. I'll not have that animal loose while this is settled." But it was already too late for chains. Wolf had followed Effie into the kitchen that morning, as he did every morning now, and at the word searched, at the footman's hand closing hard around Effie's wrist, he came off the floor with a sound none of them had heard from him before. Not the low warning growl of the stable yard, but something closer to fury, teeth bared, placing his full grey bulk squarely between Effie and every man in the room. "Send for the Duke," Mrs. Tilbury said, over the footman's shout of alarm. "Now, before this goes further than any of us can undo." The rent audit had been set for that same afternoon. Tenants gathered in the great hall to settle their winter accounts, as they did every quarter, and it was there, in front of 40 witnesses, that Duke Roland Fenwick arrived to find his housekeeper, his steward, his maid, and his dog locked in a standoff no one had yet dared to break. "Explain this," the Duke said, and the whole hall went silent. Crane recovered his composure faster than Effie expected. "Your Grace, a distressing matter. Silver missing from the plate room, and this girl found near it more than once. I regret it deeply, but I felt it my duty." "She was never near the plate room," Mrs. Tilbury said. "I can account for her evenings myself, every one of them, this fortnight past. Housekeepers are not infallible." "Nor are stewards," Effie said, and her voice carried further than she intended in the hushed hall. "Your Grace, I have proof. The household accounts have been falsified for 2 years. Coal, wages, tenant rents entered as paid when they were not. Old Tam found it before he died. He hid it and told Wolf to guard it, because he was afraid of what he'd seen the night your brother died." The word brother moved through the hall like a struck bell. The Duke's face, always so carefully controlled, went perfectly still. "You will produce this proof," he said quietly, "or you will not speak of my brother again." "It's beneath the scullery floorboard, Your Grace. I can bring it now." "Send for it," he said, and did not look away from Crane while he waited. It took only minutes. When the true ledgers were laid open on the audit table beside the false ones, the discrepancy was plain even to the tenants craning to see. Real payments against invented shortfalls, real coal against phantom loads, and Crane's own hand visible in every falsified entry, a hand every steward's clerk in the room recognized on sight. "And this," Effie said, turning to the last page, "is what old Tam wrote before he died, that he saw a man in livery leave the East Passage at midnight, the night your brother died, though that man swore to the coroner he was abed the whole night through." Crane's carefully built composure did not merely crack this time, it broke entirely. "You cannot prove that was me," he said, too quickly, too loudly, and in the silence that followed his own words seemed to hang in the air, damning enough on their own. "I never said it was you, Mr. Crane," Effie said quietly. "You did." He lunged for her then, whether to silence her or simply from raw panic. No one afterward could agree, and it was Wolf who met him halfway across the hall, not with violence this time, but with a solid, immovable wall of grey fur and old grief finally given purpose, driving Crane back against the audit table until 2 footmen, at the Duke's sharp word, took hold of him properly. "Send for the magistrate," Duke Fenwick said, and his voice, for the first time in 2 years, was not entirely steady. "And send for my brother's coroner's report. I think it wants reopening." Josiah Crane was taken before the magistrate that same week, and what the reopened inquest eventually determined, that he had confronted the old Duke over discovered evidence of his theft, and that a struggle on the east stairs had ended in a fall no one had thought to question at the time, brought the household no joy, only a quiet, aching relief that 2 years of silence had finally been broken. The tenants were repaid in full within the month, every false shortfall corrected against the true ledgers old Tam had died protecting. Mrs. Tilbury saw to it that he was given a proper headstone in the churchyard, with Wolfe's name carved beneath his own. Faithful unto the end. Over the mild protests of the new steward, who thought it irregular to memorialise a dog, the Duke overruled him without discussion. Effie was not, as it happened, sent back to the scullery. Duke Fenwick offered her the household's accounts outright, not as a courtesy, he was careful to say, but because no one else in Ashcombe Hall had proven half so honest with a column of figures, and honesty, he had learned rather late and rather hard, was worth more to him now than any title a man was born to. She took the position and the small cottage that came with it, and found she did not mind in the least that her hands, once cracked from scullery water, now ached instead from long hours over ledgers by lamplight, her own light now, burned as late as she pleased. The Duke came to her office some evenings, ostensibly to review the tenant accounts, though Mrs. Tilbury remarked more than once that his visits ran considerably longer than any set of figures required. Neither of them hurried it. Trust, Effie had learned, was not something won in a single grand gesture, but built the way a ledger was built, one honest entry at a time. And Wolfe, who had spent 2 years hating every man in Fenwick livery, took to lying across the Duke's study threshold each evening now, content at last, as though the house he guarded had finally become worth guarding without fear.